So right now, we're 5 months away from the presidential election, and there's a big choice out there between one candidate who knows America is already great and another who calls it a failure, one who honors our allies and one who heralds our enemies, one who wants to uphold the legacy of D-Day as many presidents have, and one who wants to squander it. When we're presented with a study in contrast that stark, with the stakes as high as they are, we all need to take note. Joining me now is National Co-Chair for the Biden-Harris campaign, Mitch Landrieu. Mitch, thank you so much for taking the time. I wanted to start with what I laid out there, because what struck me from watching these speeches this week of President Biden giving them overseas were, of course, the echoes of Reagan. I mean, it's a clear reminder to me, and I think many people, of how far flung from our values, America's values, Trump's values are. And part of that message was, of course, also about fighting for something bigger than yourself, as these Rangers did. So I wanted to ask you, what is the campaign hoping people watching from home, people who are just tuning in, may take away from those speeches the president gave this week?
Well, Jen, it's great to be with you, and thank you. I was, like most Americans, mesmerized by the trip this week, commemorating the 80th anniversary of the most heroic day in the history of America and the history of the world. Those young men, 17 and 18-year-olds, scaled that incredible battlefield and fought tyranny. And the president went there to remind America what sacrificing for democracy really looks like. But he was standing on the shoulders not just of Ronald Reagan, but of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was a Democrat, and, of course, General Eisenhower, who was a supreme commander, who later became the president, who was a Republican, and then Republican Ronald Reagan, and then Joe Biden. Because here's the big idea. America is the greatest country that ever was, and it's the greatest country because we're built on the greatest idea that we all come to the table of democracy as equals, and we have to defend democracy against autocracy. We never used to have a conflict between the Republican and the Democratic Party about that idea, but for some insane reason, the Republican Party now has as its head a guy that wants to turn that idea on its head, become an isolationist to get rid of NATO. NATO is a thing that has preserved the peace over time, and it is in fact true, based on Donald Trump's actions in the last couple of years, that democracy is at risk abroad and at home. And you've seen it time and time and time again. So this election is a real decision between autocracy and democracy. And notwithstanding the fact that Donald Trump is now a convicted criminal, now somebody who is declared to be a sexual abuser and, quote unquote, a rapist by a court, now somebody who's considered to be a bank fraud and have judgments against him, this man continues to talk in a way that is completely antithetical and unhinged from what the world knows about America and, of course, what Americans value in themselves. And so this choice is a choice between a guy that gets up every day and thinks about the American people and is calling on the better angels among us versus a guy who wants to tell you that everything in the world is going to hell, because that's what he sees when he looks in the mirror.
I think this contrast is so stark, as I just laid out, and couldn't agree with you more. And I'm so grateful you talked about some of the past presidents too. It's important people to remember that. There are key moments in debates, as you and in elections, as you and I both know. The debate is, of course, one of them. It's coming up in just 18 days. I mean, I'm the first to say, and I've said it many times, there's a lot of business to do in this debate. Draw that contrast you just outlined, remind voters of the choice they have. But one thing that everyone is watching is how the president will talk about Trump's convictions. I mean, you just referenced it. It is part of his story. We just learned that Trump is going to sit down with his probation officer tomorrow. What should we expect? How will the president talk about all of this in the debate in 18 days?
But can we just stop on that fact rather than, well, I'll talk about the debate in a second, but a guy that wants to be president of the United States first has to go sit down with his probation officer. That is just an astounding statement that sometimes people walk by. I don't think most Americans are going to walk by that. We can always have a debate about how big the country should be or how small, what the taxing policies are, what they're not. But at the end of the day, the president of the United States is a person who's supposed to have wisdom, character, judgment, and who's supposed to reflect the best that America has to offer. And when you put these two men next to each other and their vision of the world and their characters, in my opinion, it's not much of a choice. Even people that disagree with some of Joe Biden's policies have to agree that his character, his wisdom, and his judgment are just much more reflective of great American values. And I believe that during this debate, Joe Biden will take it to Donald Trump. Remember, Joe Biden is the only politician standing that's ever beat Donald Trump. He beat him by 8 million votes. Donald Trump is a loser. You can count how many times you can use that word for him. And at the end of the day, Joe Biden has debated Donald Trump twice and beat him both times. So I'm fully confident that the president's going to show up again and do the same thing that he's done in the past. And on Election Day, when Americans have to choose between democracy and autocracy, between goodness and bad, between the right way to do things and the wrong way to do things, they're going to choose a future for America that makes sense for who we have always been and who we want to be.
I definitely don't think we should whistle past the probation officer meeting, and I'm glad you called that out. Chris Christie had some debate advice, basically suggesting the president shouldn't engage with lies about his record and even his family. It's interesting advice, but I want to know what you think about that.
Well, which president he's talking about lying? He must be talking about Trump, because when his lips are moving,
of course
he's lying.
He is. He's talking about, he's giving advice to Joe Biden. Yes, he's giving advice to Joe Biden about ignoring Trump's lies, ignoring his attacks on his family, on Biden's family members in a debate. What do you think about that?
I understand that. Listen, Joe Biden, anybody who knows Joe Biden knows about his story. Before he was even sworn in, his wife and his child were killed. And his two of his sons were left. Joe Biden went home every night and took care of those kids. One of those kids, Beau Biden, subsequently died, as you know, tragically from brain cancer. And Hunter, as you know, had a huge problem with substance abuse. The thing that draws me to this story is not about Hunter Biden. Hunter's not running for president. Donald Trump's running for president. But what it tells me about Joe Biden is that Joe Biden is a great human being. He loves his son unconditionally. Even in his son's darkest times, Joe Biden has never left him behind, just like he's never left America behind. He's never quit. So people who talk about Joe Biden in a way that actually makes him look, old or something like that, Joe Biden shows up every day fighting for people, fighting for this country. He's done it his entire life, and that's the Joe Biden that you're going to see, who's going to take it to Trump, and he is going to beat him again in the debates, and he's going to beat him in the election, because Donald Trump is a loser. He's been a loser his entire life, and he's going to lose again. And the reason he's going to lose again is because the American people are good people. They don't believe this country is gone down the hype. They're going to lift this country up with Joe Biden.
Mitch Landrieu, always a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for taking the time this afternoon.